So this is the Subaru that everyone's been asking for a video of the walk around on. This motor is out of a 700cc Polaris XLT. It's 3 cylinders, as you can see. It's mounted onto the stock Subaru transmission right back in there. You can see some kind of crusty engineering that was involved in that. And then what we did is cut the bell housing off of the old motor and just kind of bolted it onto the Snowmobile motor. And then for the flywheel and clutch assembly, we took the old crankshaft and machined the end off that bolts onto the flywheel, and all we did was machine the taper so it would go onto the taper that was on the motor already, and bolted that on, and then the motor just slid right on. So it wasn't too hard of a project. It took a lot of sawzalling, and we just milled it flat on the mill we have. You see this isn't the intercooler that came on the car, as many people notice. That's just, we've got radiators kind of laying around. So that was one that we were going to use for a TIG torch cooler, but it got dedicated to this project. And then you see we've got the Subaru coolant reservoir here, and that just will add coolant once we get low. It's also the point we filled it from. And then this motor actually has a water pump down here for cooling and stuff. And then we've got a head temp sensor on here. This was stock. I mounted most of the electronics just up there. The oil reservoir is just kind of zip tied in place onto the coolant lines and looks like a brake line. So here in the front of the car, we've got our front motor mounts here. So it's using the stock motor mount holes, and I've got just some rubber dampers in there to help cut down on vibration. As you can see, we just welded that onto a piece of angle iron to help get the distance right, and then we welded the angle iron onto some unistrut, which just gets welded into the frame. It's welded on over there, as well as welded on right in there. For the electrical system, I just went to Walmart and got a cheap $20 Everstart battery, and it's just held in with a big zip tie right now. But this is what goes into the car. I just put quick connects on them to make life easier. This is able to charge the battery through the old alternator connection. I just put a crimp on and bolted it and wrapped it with some electrical tape for the time being. I'm planning on beefing up the electrical a little bit because this motor doesn't make enough to run the headlights 24/7. I'd like to be able to drive it at night. The plan for that is to unbolt this the pull start cover and add a spacer and add a pulley so I can mount an alternator right in front somewhere here. That'll give me plenty of power. I still have the old Subaru alternator, so that'll be a pretty easy addition. Can of starting fluid just to help. For fueling this used to be gravity fed, and it has a mechanical fuel pump down in here to feed the carbs. So what I did is we've got the fuel supply and return line, and I just teed it so this kind of just loops right through. And then we've got the line here that goes into this cheap eBay fuel pressure regulator. if we can get the white balance right. It goes into that cheap eBay fuel pressure regulator, and then that runs into the motor's mechanical fuel pump, and so far it works pretty good. So now inside the car, as you can see, I just screwed the Polaris's dash right in where the old Subaru dash used to be, and I just ran the old Polaris dash wires in through the firewall hole here that the main ECU, all the cables used to go through, and just fished it up into there. And right now RPM and all these indicators work, and the temperature indicator works. I'm planning on getting the speedometer to work, so it's a cable driven speedometer, and what I'll do is just have a motor on the back of it with an Arduino and a wheel speed sensor to roughly display my speed so I'm not going blind. And then for the fuel tank, it's just a potentiometer in the fuel tank, and I can do the same with the Arduino to make that display show up. Other than that, the heater core isn't hooked up, but all the fans and stuff work. Everything works off of the Subaru's old keys. So right down in the passenger footwell there, I've got the relays for the fuel pump and for the ignition on the motor, so the key switch will actually turn the motor on or off with that. Also inside the car here, I had a Cobb short throw installed. That went into my new WRX when this one blew up. So I also managed to lose the shift knob, so I've just got this broken screwdriver handle that fits on here good enough. And that's what I used to shift this monster. I haven't really been able to do a speed test on it yet, but mainly it just runs in first and second gear, and it's enough to get up to, I'd say, probably 30, but I'll have to do a speed test on it once it gets some plates, and we'll be able to see what this can really do. Inside the car, obviously I have no vacuum assisted brakes, so the brakes on this are pretty tight to operate here. Also the throttle pedal had to be modified, as this car was a drive-by-wire vehicle. So now we modified this to take a throttle cable, and we've got a coupling up in the front of the car, which I'll show you now. That coupling my dad made up for me. It's just a bent piece of metal that I got tech screwed on right there. That's all it is. It's got a throttle return spring here because the ones that are in the carburetor just weren't quite enough to bring it back. And that just runs down into this four-way splitter. The three black ones are for each of the carburetors. And then there's a oil pump down at the bottom, and that's where that gray cable runs to. Yeah, the throttle definitely has a lot more throw than it did stock, but that's just because of how much you got to move it to open up those throttle bodies. So lastly here, I thought I would show off the motor that got real blown up. So there's the head that gave up. Those valves that were on there just kind of vaporized off. Here we've got a piece of cylinder that, a piece of piston. As you can see, it got real chewed up. The caps that were on that were completely gone. They bent themselves flat, and when I took the head off of this motor, the piston somehow managed to wiggle itself in there upside down. So we've got just more carnage. Here you can see where I just sawzalled the bell housing off, and then here on the crankshaft you can see where that ended up getting cut off, and then that's the part that attached to the clutch, and there's the crankshaft. You can see right there where it got all chewed up. just taking this motor apart was a lot of carnage. Inside you can see all the metal flakes that are in the oil pan. Yeah, this poor vehicle went through quite a bit. But now it's got another life here with the two-stroke in it, so hopefully we can make something fun happen with that. So for starting this car, all you have to do is go into the vehicle and turn the key on, and you can crank it over with the normal Subaru starter. I left that in. That's just attached to the transmission, or on the bell housing right down there. Or you can go in and turn the key on and pull start it, but that still relies on having battery. So if your battery's completely flat, you can come in and unplug this. Unplug this wire here. I've got it labeled just kill switch, and then you can pull start it without a battery. Once it's running though, it has enough power to sustain itself, so you can plug that back in, and she's running without help from a battery. Power windows and stuff are very slow when you run it like that, but it's enough to bring them up and down. The headlights are also very dim when you do that. Like I said, I'm planning on putting the alternator in. That should help that significantly. So there's also been a lot of questions for why I did this. Really what had happened is the Subaru, I kind of blew up the motor on that. That's a whole different story. But blew up that motor, and I was looking around for a new motor and I couldn't find one. And my father was getting rid of a snowmobile that had some messed up skis. So I just told him, hey, is it alright if I take the motor? And I took the motor and the electronics and some other miscellaneous components like the exhaust, and just ended up putting it together, and me and some friends kind of came up with ways to mount things, and that's why we ended up making this disaster piece.